you start to wonder about the larger companies that are setting the standard for what green companies look like, what responsible companies look like. And I'm concerned that they seem to be focusing on the E and forgetting all about the S. You can't make the world better environmentally by reducing carbon output and addressing climate change issues while also enslaving children.
Human trafficking doesn't always take the form we first imagine. It can be found at almost any level of an organization's supply chain. What can compliance professionals do to assess human trafficking risk, and how can they leverage the resources of the organizations they work for to help root out this tragic problem? Gwen Hassan is here to help. This is Hidden Traffic.
Hello, and welcome to the year-end wrap-up episode of Hidden Traffic. This is Gwen Hassan, your host, and I'm not recording a session with a guest today. I thought I'd take a pause, and recognize that, first of all, I hit a full year on this podcast, which is amazing to me because it is not something that I expected or something that was actually in my plan. I just kind of fell into it. And now here we are, slightly over a year later. I think I have 26 or 27 episodes now. So it has been quite an experience that I'm very grateful for. So I wanted to take a moment in gratitude to pause and thank everyone who's helped me get to this place. The colleagues and friends who encouraged me to do this. Tom Fox, who, well, first of all, nudged me to do this, but also then offered to host me on his podcast network. My friends Mary Shirley and Lisa Fine, who are kind of the paradigms that I hold up for female podcasters, given their Great Women in Compliance podcast that has been so successful. And listening to their episodes and being a guest on their podcast really helped give me the basis for doing this myself. And all of my friends and family who have supported me and encouraged me and signed up to listen to the podcast, even if it wasn't particularly interesting to them. I appreciate the support and help. So let's do a quick wrap up on what 2022 has brought us in terms of human trafficking and forced labor. It has been a busy year. Lots of developments. Unfortunately, some of them very negative. A couple hopeful ones, but it's hard to see a lot of light at the end of the tunnel from where I'm sitting right now. The United Nations ILO, International Labor Organization, issued new statistics earlier this fall that reported a 25% increase in just the last 5 years in the number of people that are victims of human trafficking or forced labor. They attribute this to armed conflict, specifically noting the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the number of people that displaced and forced to leave with what they could carry out of their country, who are now vulnerable people searching for work in countries where they are not resident, where they may not know the language, which makes them more likely to be victimized by traffickers. In addition, of course, climate change, as one of my episodes this year discussed at length, is creating climate change refugees, people who are being forced to leave their homes because the industries that used to exist there do not because of climate change. The types of opportunities that once were available no longer are because of the impact of climate change, which again makes them more susceptible and more vulnerable to being trafficked as well. So the new number, the staggering number, is that there are 50 million people in the world who are currently being held in some form of modern slavery. To picture that number, 50 million seems like an unimaginable number, but it means if you got 150 people in a room, that one of them, so one of every 150 people in the world, is currently subject to some type of modern slavery. Of those, roughly 27.5 million are in some form of forced labor, including in that number over 3 million children who are currently in some form of forced labor, and about roughly half of those that are in commercial sexual exploitation forms of forced labor, which is just heartbreaking. Then another 22 million that have been forced into marriage, the majority of whom are under the age of 15, 2/3 of whom are girls, and a third of which are boys. So all of these numbers just in my lower moments make me feel like the work that we are all trying to do is a drop in the bucket and that it's not making much of an impact, but I'm going to keep trying anyway. Notable news stories around human trafficking over the past year. As I record this, we're in the final stages of the World Cup. And unfortunately, there were some very harrowing stories coming out of the World Cup in relation to the people that were brought in, many of them migrant workers, many of them trafficked in to help build the facilities necessary for the World Cup. There were, I believe, 8 new gigantic, soccer pitches, football pitches built for the World Cup. And they were built using substantially migrant labor that was brought in from places like Nepal and Bangladesh and India. And those people were often apparently, allegedly subject to really terrible working conditions. Working on a construction site when it's 110 degrees outside Fahrenheit with no access to water, forced overtime, living in very substandard living conditions. The government of Qatar, or I'm not sure, it might be pronounced Qatar, either way, has said that they have been working very diligently to prevent these kinds of things from happening and bringing bad employers to task on their treatment. But an interview that CNN conducted with some workers, one of them said that he had held 3 different jobs in the last 4 years since coming to Qatar. And in that time, only one of the employers actually followed the working rules set by the government to protect workers. So the idea that the world is gathering to watch the World Cup and that it's enjoying the spirit of competition around the world, but at the same time knowing that allegedly thousands of people died in the process of trying to prepare for the World Cup, and that most of those people were migrant workers is sad to me. And to know that many of them were, forced and working in forced labor conditions makes you question the ability to enjoy the World Cup a bit. Another big story this year has been, of course, the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act that came into play in June to much fanfare. Interestingly, when it first came into force, there was kind of a generalized panic that I experienced in talking to various importers, because they were quite sure that, they were not going to be able to get any of their goods in anymore. And were very concerned also that it would expand quickly from simply only the Xinjiang region of China to other parts of China, or China as a whole. And I don't think that their fears are that far off, because we're now hearing that Europe has been discussing and is examining a China-wide policy or presumption of forced labor usage. So all goods that would come in to the European Union with a source country of China would be immediately suspected of having been made with forced labor. That has not passed yet. It has not been adopted by the member states, but it is in discussion. So stay tuned for the 2023 episodes. We'll be following that very carefully to see what happens in Europe and elsewhere, for that matter. But this points generally to another issue we've seen that I'm going to refer to as the green push and the hypocrisy associated therewith. There is this overall effort, especially within ESG practices, environmental, social, and governance practices, sometimes known as corporate social responsibility, to drive towards lower emissions and electric cars and electric vehicles, trucks and buses, and the need for improving kind of the carbon footprint of a company. And that drive, while I understand it and support it, I'm concerned that it's actually also driving and incentivizing human trafficking in many ways. So there's a allegation that's been filed against Tesla, who, arguably leads the world in electrified vehicle production, but allegedly their primary source of cobalt is mined by children. So at what cost are we electrifying the world? Are we doing so on the backs of, young children? Similar allegations against Apple. 7 suppliers of Apple have now been explicitly linked to forced labor. And interestingly, Apple lobbied against the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. It was, of course, passed anyway, but you start to wonder about the larger companies that are setting the standard for what green companies look like, what responsible companies look like. And I'm concerned that they seem to be focusing on the E and forgetting all about the S. You can't make the world better environmentally by reducing carbon output and addressing climate change issues while also enslaving children. So I will be watching this in the new year to see, what kind of developments there are. Hopefully there will be, an effort on the part of many large companies to make sure that they're covering not only the E in ESG, but making a concerted effort to look at social and societal factors as well. And one of the ways I really encourage people in corporations to do that is to take a look at the Responsible Contracting Initiative. If you haven't already, there's an episode dedicated to the Responsible Contracting Initiative. My friends Olivia Spencer and Sarah Dadish are working very hard to help companies, organizations in general, understand that the terms that they use to contract with their supply chains are important, because those terms may, in fact, inadvertently, unknowingly, be driving the demand for human trafficking. So I recommend to all of you, if you haven't yet, to take a look at the Responsible Contracting Initiative and the toolkit that they have for corporations there. It is a hopeful sign in a year of, otherwise kind of difficult news, that there's real possibility of change. It will take time, especially in corporate America, but I'm cautiously optimistic that will happen over time. In terms of what I'm looking for in the new year, in terms of the podcast, I am busy planning guests and episodes. I'm going to be talking to someone about the new Supply Chain Due Diligence Act in Japan and what the human rights implications are for that act. I am in discussions with someone right now at the McCain Institute to talk to them about their work in connection with human trafficking prevention. I have a couple of corporations I'm speaking to about their efforts in relation to human trafficking, and I look forward, hopefully, to sharing their stories about, where they started, what they've done, what their kind of next phase of work is in terms of within their compliance programs, how they are working to ensure that their supply chains are not supporting human trafficking in some way. So it should be a good year. I am excited about the new people I will meet and grateful for all the new people I have met this year. That's one thing the podcast has really given me, is I am constantly meeting amazing people who are doing really good work and are passionately devoted to trying to make the world a better place and reducing human trafficking, forced labor, child labor. And the ability to talk to these people and get to know these people has been a real highlight to my year. It has reminded me also that there are good people around the world who are conscientious and concerned, and not only concerned, but willing to put action behind their concern. So thank you again to all of my listeners and to all of my guests. And I wish all of you nothing but a healthy and happy and joyous holiday season, no matter how you celebrate. And New Year wishes for health and happiness and success in 2023. And we'll talk to you again mid-January when we return. Thank you. Take care, everyone.